Someone at some point in your life told you that you were too sensitive. Maybe they said it gently, as concern. Maybe they said it sharply, as an accusation. Either way, some part of you believed them, and quietly began the lifelong project of shrinking your own perception down to a size other people found more comfortable. Think about what that actually asked of you. Not to feel less. That was never really possible. It asked you to stop naming what you felt, to stop trusting what you noticed, to treat your own nervous system as an unreliable narrator, simply because it registered things other people's nervous systems didn't. And somewhere in that quiet negotiation, a strange, corrosive belief took root, that there is something wrong with you for perceiving what everyone else has simply learned to ignore. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in modern psychology, and almost no one frames it correctly. The conversation is rarely about who feels the most. It is about who filters the least. What gets called sensitivity is, in a striking number of cases, not an excess of emotion at all. It is an absence of the numbing that most people, often without realizing it, have spent a lifetime developing. You are not malfunctioning. You may simply be one of the few people in the room whose detection system was never switched off. This video is not going to tell you that sensitivity is a superpower, because that framing, however well-intentioned, quietly dismisses just how disorienting it can feel to move through a world that keeps telling you to turn down a volume you never chose to turn up. Instead, this is an investigation into where that perceptual difference actually comes from, why it gets pathologized so consistently, and what changes the moment you stop asking what's wrong with you and start asking, what exactly you have been noticing all along. Picture a family dinner where the conversation on the surface is pleasant, but something underneath it feels tense. Most of the people at that table continue eating, talking, laughing, entirely unbothered. One person at the table, though, feels a tightening in their chest they can't quite explain. They can't point to a single sentence that was wrong. They just know with a certainty that feels almost physical that something beneath the surface has shifted. Later, it turns out they were right. An argument had happened earlier that no one mentioned. A resentment had been simmering for weeks. The sensitive one, the person everyone quietly labeled as dramatic or overly emotional, was the only one who accurately read the room. This is not a coincidence, and it is not magic. It is a documented, measurable phenomenon that neuroscience has spent the last 2 decades mapping with increasing precision. Researchers studying what is now called sensory processing sensitivity have found that roughly 15 to 20% of people, across species, not just humans, possess a nervous system that processes environmental and social information more deeply than the general population. This is not a disorder. It is a trait, likely maintained by evolution for a specific reason, one that becomes clearer the longer you sit with it. Evolutionary psychologists have proposed a compelling explanation for why a trait like this would survive across thousands of generations instead of being bred out as inefficient. In any group of early humans, survival didn't just depend on strength or speed. It depended on information, and specifically on someone in the group noticing danger, tension, or change before it became an emergency. A tribe made entirely of people who reacted only to obvious, immediate threats would be vulnerable to the slow, creeping dangers, a shift in a rival group's behavior, the subtle unease of an ally who might soon become an enemy, the early signs of scarcity before it became famine. The presence of a smaller number of highly perceptive individuals, tuned to subtler signals, functioned as an early warning system for the entire group. Their sensitivity wasn't a liability the tribe tolerated. It was a resource the tribe depended on, whether or not anyone at the time understood why. But something even more uncomfortable is happening beneath the surface of this trait, because being the early warning system in a group comes at a cost that evolution never fully solved. The same nervous system that picks up on danger before anyone else also picks up on everything else. The tension in someone's jaw, the slight delay before a friend answers a question, the almost imperceptible change in tone that most people filter out automatically. This means a highly sensitive nervous system is not selectively perceptive. It is broadly perceptive, taking in far more raw data per moment than a less sensitive one, and processing all of it more deeply before deciding what to discard. Neuroscientists studying this trait have found increased activity in brain regions associated with awareness, empathy, and the integration of sensory information, essentially confirming, at the level of brain imaging, what sensitive people have been trying to describe about themselves for years, that they are not imagining the intensity of their own experience. They are, quite literally, running more computation on the same input everyone else receives. Which means the exhaustion so many sensitive people describe at the end of an ordinary day is not a sign of weakness. It is the accurate, physiological cost of processing significantly more information than the room around them ever registered. Think about the last time someone dismissed a feeling you had by pointing out that nothing had technically happened. No one raised their voice. No rule was broken. And yet you knew, with total clarity, that something was wrong. This is where psychology becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because it reveals how often we are taught to trust the absence of obvious evidence over the presence of accurate perception, simply because obvious evidence is easier for other people to verify. Carl Jung offers a crucial framework for understanding what happens to a person who spends years being told their perception is excessive. Jung wrote extensively about the danger of disowning parts of the self that don't fit the persona a person is expected to present to the world. A highly perceptive individual, repeatedly told their sensitivity is a flaw, often begins to split their experience into two categories: the acceptable, rational observations they're allowed to voice, and the deeper, more nuanced perceptions they learn to suppress, because expressing them invited ridicule or dismissal. Jung would call this a wound to the authentic self, a forced amputation of exactly the faculty that made the person valuable in the first place. Over time, this suppression doesn't just silence the sensitivity, it teaches the person to distrust their own inner signals entirely, creating a strange, disorienting condition where they can sense that something is true, and simultaneously doubt themselves for sensing it. This is where the conversation stops being about temperament and starts becoming about the architecture of your own history. Think about how many times you softened an observation because you anticipated it would be met with irritation. Think about how many times you talked yourself out of a concern that later turned out to be completely accurate, simply because no one else in the room seemed to share it. Each of these moments, individually small, accumulates into something larger, a pattern of self-erasure that trains a naturally perceptive mind to second-guess exactly the instrument that made it capable of perceiving accurately in the first place. Picture the specific childhood scene where this pattern often first takes root. A child comes home from school and says something feels wrong with a friendship, that a friend has been acting distant, cold, quietly excluding them from something. A parent, exhausted, distracted, or simply unable to see what the child is describing, responds with reassurance instead of curiosity, telling the child they're overthinking it, that everyone is still friends, that there's nothing to worry about. Weeks later, the friendship ends exactly the way the child predicted. But by then, the lesson has already been absorbed at a much deeper level than the specific event itself. The child learns not that their friend was distant, but that voicing an accurate perception gets met with correction rather than validation. Repeated enough times, across enough small moments, this becomes a template, teaching an accurate perceiver that the safest response to their own perception is silence. Alfred Adler adds a precise psychological explanation for why this erasure happens so consistently across families and social groups. Adler observed that groups, whether families, friendships, or workplaces, often develop an unspoken equilibrium, a set of unexamined agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged out loud. A highly sensitive person, simply by noticing what the group has silently agreed to ignore, becomes a disruption to that equilibrium. not because they are causing a problem, but because they are making an existing problem visible. Groups, Adler noted, will frequently protect their equilibrium by pathologizing the person who threatens it, labeling them dramatic, oversensitive, or difficult, rather than confronting the discomfort the sensitive person has accidentally surfaced. This means the label often has almost nothing to do with the sensitive person's actual accuracy, and almost everything to do with the group's collective discomfort at being seen clearly. The next realization changes everything, because it reframes an entire category of behavior most sensitive people have spent years apologizing for. What gets called overreacting is frequently not an exaggerated response to a small event. It is an accurate response to the full scope of an event that other people have only partially perceived. A sensitive person crying after what looks, from the outside, like a minor disagreement, is often not reacting to that single conversation. They are reacting to the accumulated pattern that conversation just confirmed. A pattern the less perceptive people in the room genuinely never noticed, because their nervous systems filtered it out before it ever reached conscious awareness. Viktor Frankl offers an unexpected but powerful lens into why perception, even painful perception, carries such profound value. Frankl argued that meaning is not found by numbing oneself to the difficulty of existence, but by engaging with it directly, by allowing the full weight of an experience to register rather than deflecting it. A person who perceives deeply, who feels the tension in a room, the grief behind someone's forced smile, the quiet desperation underneath a friend's bravado, is not burdened with an excess of feeling. They are engaging with reality more completely than those around them. And while that engagement is undeniably heavier to carry, Frankl's work suggests it is also the very capacity that allows a person to find genuine depth, genuine connection, and genuine meaning that a more numbed existence simply cannot access. This is where the Stoics offer something that might initially sound contradictory until the deeper layer reveals itself. Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius all wrote extensively about controlling one's emotional reactions, and this has often been misread as an instruction to feel less. Read more carefully. The Stoic project was never about numbing perception. It was about separating accurate perception from the story layered on top of it. Epictetus made a sharp distinction between an impression, the raw data a person perceives, and the judgment added to that impression, the interpretation, the catastrophizing, the meaning assigned afterward. A highly sensitive person's perception is frequently accurate. What sometimes goes awry is not the noticing itself, but the narrative constructed around it. A distinction the Stoics understood intimately, and one that offers a genuinely useful tool, not to suppress sensitivity, but to separate what was actually perceived from the anxious story that perception sometimes gets wrapped in afterward. Watch closely what this means in practice. A highly sensitive person walks into a meeting and immediately senses tension between two colleagues. That perception, the raw data, is likely accurate. The narrative that often gets attached to it afterward, the assumption that the tension is somehow their fault, or that they need to fix it immediately, or that everyone can see they're anxious about it, is a separate layer entirely, one built not from perception, but from years of being told their noticing was itself the problem. Learning to hold these two things apart, the accurate signal and the anxious story wrapped around it, is one of the most transformative skills a sensitive person can develop, because it allows them to keep the gift without inheriting the exhausting emotional labor that was never actually part of it. Consider how differently this same meeting could unfold for two people with identical perceptual accuracy, but different relationships to what they notice. One walks out of the room replaying the tension for the rest of the day, quietly convinced they somehow caused it, exhausted by an internal narrative that has nothing to do with what they actually observed. The other notices the same tension, files it as useful information, perhaps mentions it privately to someone who might need to know, and moves on with their day largely unburdened. The difference between these two outcomes was never the sharpness of their perception. Both perceived the room with equal accuracy. The difference was entirely in what happened after the noticing. whether the raw signal was allowed to remain simply information, or whether it was immediately buried under years of inherited anxiety about what noticing things has historically cost them. Behavioral psychology adds another layer to why this pattern becomes so deeply ingrained over a lifetime. Every time a sensitive person voices an accurate observation and is met with dismissal, ridicule, or the accusation of being dramatic, their brain logs that expression as socially costly, gradually training them, through simple reinforcement, to suppress future observations before they're even spoken aloud. This is not a conscious choice. It is conditioning, the same mechanism that shapes any learned behavior, quietly teaching an accurate perceiver to distrust the very instrument that made them valuable, simply because expressing what they noticed was repeatedly punished by people less equipped to notice it themselves. There is also a specific cognitive bias working against sensitive people from the outside. One psychologist called the bias blind spot. Our tendency to assume that our own perception of a situation is simply objective reality, rather than one interpretation among several. The people at that family dinner who felt nothing tense weren't lying about their experience. They genuinely didn't perceive what the sensitive person perceived. And because their own experience felt complete and accurate to them, they assumed the sensitive person's different experience must be the distorted one. This is rarely malicious. It is simply the natural result of two nervous systems processing different amounts of the same information, and each assuming their own version constitutes the whole truth. This asymmetry explains why sensitive people are so often outnumbered in these disagreements, not because they are wrong more often, but because the majority in the room shares a narrower band of perception. And shared perception, however incomplete, tends to feel more like consensus reality than a single person's wider, more accurate reading of the room. Most people believe that sensitivity is something to be managed, softened, or eventually outgrown. In reality, the research on this trait suggests something closer to the opposite. Highly sensitive individuals, when supported rather than pathologized, consistently show greater capacity for empathy, deeper creative insight, and a more nuanced understanding of complex social situations than their less sensitive peers. The trait itself was never the problem. The problem was an environment that consistently punished accurate perception, because that perception was inconvenient, disruptive to an equilibrium, or simply unfamiliar to people who had never developed the same depth of processing. This is where psychology becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because it suggests that a great deal of what gets treated as an individual flaw is actually an environmental mismatch, a perceptive nervous system operating inside social systems that were built, often unconsciously, around the assumption that less noticing is the default and more noticing is the deviation. Flip that assumption, and an entirely different picture emerges. The deviation was never the sensitivity. It was a culture that trained itself to filter out exactly the information a small percentage of its members were built to register. There is a quiet, almost overwhelming relief hidden inside this reframe. Because it means the years spent apologizing for noticing too much, feeling too deeply, sensing what no one else acknowledged, were not evidence of a flaw that needed correcting. They were evidence of a perceptual capacity that was never taught how to hold its own accuracy without collapsing into shame every time that accuracy made someone else uncomfortable. Learning to trust what you notice, while gently releasing the anxious story that often gets layered on top of it, is not about becoming less feeling. It is about finally allowing the instrument you were born with to function the way it was always designed to. It is the difference between distrusting a smoke detector because its alarm feels inconvenient and understanding that the alarm was never the problem, only the fire it was built to notice long before anyone else could smell the smoke. So here is the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. How many times across your life has something you sensed turned out later to be exactly right, even when everyone around you insisted at the time that you were imagining it? And what would change, not in the world around you, but in the way you carry yourself through it, if the next time that happens, You finally decided to believe yourself first. If this kind of psychology, the kind that sits with you long after the video ends, is something you genuinely connect with, consider subscribing, because this channel exists for exactly this, quietly uncovering the patterns running beneath the surface of ordinary life.